Okay, well, what about another one then? Shalom peace. Shalom peace is a much deeper meaning, a Hebrew word. Wholeness, integrity, prosperity, completeness, a sense of well-being at the deepest level. All right. Now, is it a requirement of forgiveness that you now have shalom peace in yourself? Well, you might not, because you might be so violated by the incident or the relationship or by the abuse that for a time at least you lose your shalom peace and you don't feel wholesome and prosperous and totally a strong sense of well-being and wholeness. You don't feel that at all. You might feel utterly violated. Well, again, as we saw, that doesn't mean that you haven't forgiven the person, because it's not a requirement of forgiveness that you then snap out of it. God never tells you to snap out of things, get over it. All these are man-made words and are not biblical, because your feelings might be absolutely ravaged by what's happened. That doesn't mean you haven't forgiven. And so frequently people are put under pressure to do more than is involved in the word forgive. They're put under pressure by other people who don't understand what forgiveness is. They're put under pressure by themselves because they don't understand what it is. And so they feel guilty or inadequate or wretched because they're not doing what they should do. They're a sincere person who wants to obey God, but due to their wrong definition, they feel they're not obeying God. Therefore, they feel wretched because they're not obeying and forgiving people. But in fact, they're just confusing their feelings with their decisions. So, who else does it come from? Demons whispering into our ears to get us to be confused about what's happening and to tell us that we're not being forgiving. Now, the reason they might tell us we're not being forgiving is not because they want us to forgive. They might be well aware that you have forgiven. They want you to be wretched. They want you to be in a bad way. They want you to be, your emotions all over the place. They want you to feel guilty and bad by not understanding what you're doing. All right, another word, mercy. Now that's clearly linked to forgiveness, but it's not the same thing. So mercy is choosing not to do or not to give to person B what they deserve. So person B might deserve a certain thing, but you choose not to give it to them or not to do it to them. And we're going to look at another word in a minute, grace. What does grace mean? Choosing to give to person B what he does not deserve. Choosing to do for him what he does not deserve you to do for him. Now those two words, mercy and grace, let's look at them together. It might be right for you to show mercy to person B, but it might not be. So how would you show mercy? By choosing perhaps not to go to the police, or by not choosing to sue him, or not requiring the full your rights to be given to you in some way. How might you show grace? By giving him something. He might have done something harmful to you or treated you badly, but you choose to give him something or help him in some way, or do something on his behalf. Now that would be to show grace to him. Now either of those two things might be appropriate in a situation, and they might not necessarily be appropriate. So you could forgive person B, but choose not to exercise any further grace towards him other and beyond forgiving him. Or it might be that you choose to forgive him, but not to show him mercy beyond forgiving him. And you go to the police, or you go to see a solicitor, or you go to see the local council, and you report him, and that's not inconsistent. So I'm using a lot of examples that have to do with more major matters, going to police about things. But frequently these things, most of the time, these things involve little matters. So someone's treating you badly, and now they come again and want to borrow your lawnmower. The last time they took your lawnmower, they damaged your lawnmower. You've gone and bought a new lawnmower. Now, along comes person B again, and he wants to borrow the lawnmower. Now, you've forgiven him for what he did to the previous lawnmower. You might or might not have required him to pay something for it. That would not necessarily make your forgiveness be inconsistent with forgiveness. But let's look now. What about, should you show grace towards him? Should you let him have the lawnmower again? Now, if you give him the lawnmower again, you're extending grace towards him, aren't you? You're giving person B a lawnmower that he does not deserve, has no right to ask for it, no legitimate entitlement or expectation of being allowed anybody's lawnmower ever again. So, to give him a lawnmower, to bring it down to a really simple, basic level, would be an action of grace. It would be you showing grace to person B. Now, are you under an obligation to show grace to person B in that regard? Well, if you said, no, I'm sorry, B, but you've broken the previous lawnmower, I've bought this new one, and I don't think the way you treat lawnmowers is the right way to treat lawnmowers. So I'm not going to let you have this new lawnmower. So you've not extended grace towards him. Does that mean you haven't forgiven him? No. The answer is no. You've totally forgiven him. It's just that you've chosen not to show grace. So, but you might show grace. You might let him have the lawnmower. The point I'm getting at is it's not necessarily required as part of forgiveness. Okay. Magnanimity is another word. What's magnanimity? It's being in a position of being the victor or the one in power. And when you're in power, you're in victory, you choose not to fully exercise all the options that are available to you, all the rights that are now available to you as the victor or the winner or the one in power. And you don't use all your power. Do you see? Now, it might be that you've forgiven B, but now you find yourself in a position of power over him. It might be that you choose to do all the things that he deserves to have done to him. Or it might be that you don't. That's a separate decision.
Is that not a form of judgment?
No, because you see, the thing is, that's a very good question actually, because I wanted to deal with this earlier. What do we mean by judge? You see, there are more than one meaning to the word judge. You see, the Bible commands us not to judge. But it also commands us in the very next verse to judge. So, what do you make of that? The answer is there are two different senses of the word judge. So we're commanded not to judge in the sense of sitting in Jesus' chair. That we mustn't do. We're not to judge person B in terms of what punishment or how Jesus should deal with him for his wrongdoing. That we're not to do. But we are commanded to judge everybody in the right sense of the word judge, and that means to evaluate their theology, for one thing, and secondly, to evaluate their character. So you need to evaluate the theology and character of other people and decide whether you can trust them, decide whether they're a suitable person to lend a lawnmower to, decide whether you're going to... Now, person B used to work alongside you in your office. 2 years ago, person B did harm to you. 2 years later, you've been appointed shift manager. Now you're over person B. Do you see? Now you have to make decisions about how to run that shift. Now some of the decisions you make in being shift manager might involve doing things that are detrimental to the interests of person B. Now if it's legitimate to do those things, you'll do those things. But you're not necessarily therefore not forgiving person B. You've got a job to do. Do you see? You've got to get on with your life and do the things you need to do. So that doesn't mean that you're not forgiving person B. Let me try and speed up a touch. So, oh yes, all out of the hot air balloon now. Let's look at some of the harm that unforgiveness does to a person, because if we speak of the correct definition now of unforgiveness, so we're not talking about lending lawnmowers, we're talking about holding on to the perceived right to judge person B, where you consider yourself, you're wanting vengeance, you're wanting retribution, you want to get even, you want to poke him in the eye, you want to get back at him, you want to be the one who judges him and punishes him. The harm that does to you. What I would suggest is that having that feeling of unforgiveness in you, that the sin of unforgiveness creates like a reservoir of chemicals inside you that make you feel terrible and have a very bad impact upon the way you feel for a start, it turns into bitterness, which is a really bad thing. And people who have a lot of bitterness will frequently actually get literally ill with cancer and other complaints. And I'm thinking perhaps of a lady who, her son was murdered by one of the Moors murderers. And she used to appear on television for years afterwards. Every time anyone ever spoke about releasing Myra Hindley, this woman would be phoned up by some TV station, will you appear? And she'd come on the telly and say, I'll never forgive them. I'll never forgive them for what they did. And I remember hearing her say it. And your heart goes out to her. Because it was a terrible situation she was in. But the point is, now here's this woman, this is the injustice of it. She's had this terrible thing done to her son. And even 20, 30, 40 years later, her life was wrecked by it. And she died in the end and never reached a place of peace or forgiveness. Now, this is how unjust and awful it is. But the point is that if we don't forgive people, the harm comes to us, not to them, because they're facing the same judgment. You see, Jesus is not going to not judge them, he's going to judge them. So what Myra Hindley and Ian Brady did to those children will be judged. You see, it's going to get judged. And when we hand it over to him, the principal beneficiary of that is us. So the command to forgive, in large measure, is given, not just so that we don't usurp Jesus' place. It's not just for that reason. It's for our benefit. Because if we don't forgive, we become poisoned with bitterness. And if you contrast that lady with another man in Enniskillen, when his daughter was killed there, everyone knows the case, but after the thing, he chose to forgive them. That didn't mean he approved of them or any of these other absurd things we've been looking at. He didn't approve of what they did, but he released it. He knew that they'd be judged. He was an evangelical Christian. He knew the Bible. He knew exactly what was going to happen to those men. But he released them from his own life. So he no longer had it on his case list, and he let it go. And so in Hebrews 12:15 we're told, see to it that no one fail to obtain the grace of God, that no root of bitterness spring up and cause trouble, and by it the many become defiled. So we're not to be bitter. Now being bitter is another word for holding on to unforgiveness and the desire for vengeance and retribution and the desire to judge others in the wrong sense of the word. And we will pay a high price for it in terms of our spiritual well-being and even our health. But there's another reason. Illegitimately judging other people brings God's judgment upon ourselves. So if we're merciful and forgiving, God will be merciful and forgiving with us. But if we're harsh and strict and unyielding, then he will be more like that with us. So Matthew 7:1-2 says, do not judge so that you'll be not judged. For in the way you judge, you will be judged. And by your standard of measure, it will be measured to you. And then Matthew 5:7 says, blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Now you want to make sure that the judgment seat, that one of the things on your appraisal form is that you had a very generous standard of judgment of others, and that you were very generous in the way you dealt with others, and the way you forgave others, and the mercy and grace that you showed towards people. You want it to say that you consistently displayed those characteristics, because then they will be shown to you.
Romans 2:1 says the same thing,
yeah.
Doesn't it? Therefore thou art inexcusable, O man. Whosoever thou art that judgest, for wherein thou judgest another, thou condemnest thyself. For thou that judgest doest the same things.
Yes, that's right. So what if the wrongdoer is unrepentant and unconcerned? So we're starting to get the theme of this now. If the wrongdoer is unrepentant and unconcerned, that makes it hard in our feelings, doesn't it? But it doesn't actually have any bearing upon the decision that we have to make. So the wrongdoer's lack of remorse is a kind of fresh insult that keeps being given to you. So there he is, he's done the harm to you, but you're perhaps even more wounded by his lack of remorse, an ongoing lack of remorse, than you were by his original wrong. But the way it works is simply this. every time he's doing that to you, that's another thing for you to just forgive and hand over. So no one's saying it's easy. But what's difficult about that, the difficulty is what it does to your feelings. The theology of it is not difficult. You're to hand it over and let Jesus judge the whole thing. And keep letting him judge the whole thing. But the fact that your feelings keep getting inflamed because of the way you continue to be dealt with is a separate issue.
Yeah.
And that's a feelings-based matter, which is not inconsistent with forgiving. Moreover, we have to keep forgiving each fresh violation in the same way as the first one.
That's a difficult thing to do, isn't it?
Very difficult.
Because I found myself in a situation where somebody had done me a great wrong.
Yeah.
And they kept on reminding me that I've got to forgive them 70 times 7.
Yeah.
And they kept on doing it.
Yes. Yes. Well, you see, the thing is, what does that say about that person's understanding of the concept of repentance? You see, if the person knows enough about the Bible to know that, they know enough about the Bible to know that they should repent. And speaking in that manner, that taunting manner, and that presumptuous way, is not consistent with repentance. And the thing is, that person is bringing a heavy judgment upon themselves. And what we each need to concern ourselves with, the main thing should be, how can we make sure that we have a light judgment? Because I want Jesus to go easy on me. And I want him to say, look, I'm going to give you a lot of leeway. You've done a lot of wrong things in your life, but I'm going to give you a lot of slack. Because I noticed that you were very merciful towards others and you forgave a lot of people. So I'm going to judge you in the context of all that. Do you see? And then the wrong things we've done will be treated differently.
When you're a young Christian and you don't have the understanding that you're giving to us today,
Yeah.
that is a very, very difficult situation
Yes.
to try and deal with.
Oh, it
It
is.
can
Yeah.
almost destroy your faith.
Yes, it can do. It can do. But a correct understanding of forgiveness and of how narrow it is can really help you to maintain your faith. Because, you see, I would liken it to this. In asking us to forgive, Jesus is telling us to learn and do the 5 times table. Now, if you misheard him and you think he's saying, learn your times tables, right? So now you think he means the 7 times table and the 12 times table. He means the 17 times table, the 28 times table. He means the 59 times table. You've got to know all these times tables. And there you are, stressed out, trying to learn them, trying to remember that you can't do it. You know that you're commanded to learn the times tables, but you just can't do it. You can't meet his requirements. Well, all he said was, learn the 5 times table and do that. He didn't say, learn your times tables. Do you see?
Yeah.
And so we're laying burdens on ourselves that he hasn't laid upon us. But if we understand how narrow forgiveness is, that's not to say that it's easy, but it's, at any rate, it's narrow. It's recusing yourself, handing it over to Jesus, stepping aside, letting him judge it. If you see it in that light, it's a great deal easier to do. Okay. Let's look, I'm going to try and speed up more. How do we forgive in practical terms? How do we actually do it? Because the point is that you can begin from a place, we all begin from a place where we're not forgiving the person. So how do we move from not forgiving the person to forgiving the person? How do we get there? Well, I would suggest that the best place to start with is to pray about it and to tell God exactly how you feel about it. There's never any need or benefit from pretending things to God. You might as well just tell God exactly what you feel. The advantage of telling God exactly what you feel is not for his benefit, because he already knows what you feel. The benefit of telling him what you feel is so that you realise for yourself what you feel and where you really stand.
Yeah.
So you might begin by saying, well, the reality of it is, Lord, that I don't actually forgive this person. I'm consumed with anger and bitterness, and that's where I really am. Say that to him. Tell him that that's what you feel. And you can ask God to help you to be willing. You see, so you could say, well, if you're not willing to forgive, ask him to help you to be willing. If you're not willing to be willing, ask him to help you to be willing to be willing. Do you see? Start from where you're really at and don't be pretentious about it. So you might pray something along these lines. I've written this. It says, the truth is, I'm not yet willing to forgive, but I want to get to a place where I could be willing. Please change my heart attitude and help me to become willing to forgive person X. Now, if you make a sincere, unpretentious prayer like that, what do you think God will do? Do you think God will say, no, I'm not having this. I said, forgive person. I'm not having you seeking my help. No way. Now you do it and don't ask me for any help. Does that sound like the God that we know? So if you go to him and just speak the plain truth to him, he will respond as you fully expect him to, as you know that he will. And he'll say, right, I know that you now are facing the reality of it. I already knew that you weren't forgiving X. I already knew that perfectly well. But I'm glad that you've realised it. And I'm glad that you're now seeking my help. But another trick that you can play is this. Begin to pray in general terms for the benefit of the person. So let's imagine person B has really wronged you, or is even continuing to wrong you. That makes it so much harder. But they're continuing to wrong you. Let's imagine you've asked God to help you to be willing to be willing. On another thing, alongside that, begin to pray for the benefit of the person. Now the advantage of this is this. That is entirely under the control of your will. You can make your tongue do things, you can make your mouth say things, even through gritted teeth, can't you? So you can pray for the benefit of person B and pray for him to have good health and pray for his family. As you do that, a number of things are changing. Because you can't control what you feel, but you can control what you say and do. You can't make yourself feel predisposed towards person B or well disposed. Can't, but you can make yourself say things. So you can say things on his behalf. Doing that will change you on the inside. It'll alter your attitude and also bring healing to you. But it also changes the way God deals with you. He'll help you. So praying for your enemies and persecutors is not idealistic sort of silliness. It's hard-headed common sense. First of all, we're commanded to. But secondly, it's solid common sense. So, forgiveness is not something we feel, it's something we do. Now, how many people get confused about this? Talking about feeling forgiving. No, you're never commanded to feel forgiving. You're commanded to forgive as an action of your will. Not. Except Judge A that took blogs off his list and put him on Judge B's list. Do we even care what Judge A feels? We just want him off that list. We want Judge A to take his next door neighbour off his list and put him on Judge. We're not bothered what Judge A feels about the neighbour. We just want him off the list, don't we? So forgiveness is not something we feel, it's something we do. It's something we decide through our will. And also, sometimes forgiveness is possible only in stages. If that's the case, then straightforwardly tell God that. Just say to him, well, actually, I realise I'm not forgiving yet, but I want to get there. Will you please help me to get to the next stage? Help me to be willing. Help me to pray for him. Then will you please respond by changing me on the inside and make me able to make that decision? And it will quickly come. If you're praying in that way, God will make it possible. Another good thing that helps with forgiveness is to ask God to show you your own faults. Now, how many people pray for that? But if you ask God to show you what's wrong with you, he will, he wants to, he's eager to, and it's really helpful to you in all sorts of ways. Because most of us are blind to our own faults. We operate hypocritically, and we wrestle with our inability to forgive X, and yet we're doing loads of things that upset A, B, C, D and E, but we are not bothered about that. We're bothered about X upsetting us. Well, if you were given a degree of revelation about this, where God explained to you how you've upset C and D and E and F and G, the penny might drop and you might be able to see X in a different light as a fellow wrongdoer. Do you see? Because forgiving others helps you to see your own need for repentance and your own need for forgiveness.
I find as well that unforgiveness, if I've had unforgiveness in my life, it's a barrier between me and God.
Of course it is.
It's a barrier to communion. I can't have real communion with God if I've got unforgiveness in my heart.
Unforgiveness is a big barrier between you and God, undoubtedly. And that's not to say that he takes away from us our justification or salvation, not at all. But what it does mean is it impairs our relationship with him, our fellowship with him. We're not on the same speaking terms because we're acting improperly, we're being disobedient, we're showing a bad attitude.
You're sitting on his chair.
We're sitting on his chair, yeah. That's right, exactly. So, when and how does God judge and punish? Well, I'm going to speed through this, but he does it in all sorts of ways. So God will use human institutions and governments and courts and police and so on. They're all his agents. They all work for him. They're all appointed by him. We know that Paul tells us that they don't bear the sword in vain. Those people are put there by him. So we can use those institutions and those facilities. That's not inconsistent with forgiving. And they're a small foretaste of what the final judgment is going to be. And so there will come judgment, and we can be encouraged and take comfort sometimes from that. Okay. What about disputes with fellow Christians? I'll try and just give you a brief overview of this. Now, Paul tells us, not in 1 Corinthians 6, 1-7, he criticises the church in Corinth because they're going to law with each other, suing each other over disputes and things. And he says, why don't you not do that? Let the church decide. Let the church judge these things. Now, I've struggled with this, and also with Matthew 18, because Jesus tells us to go to the church with disputes and so on. I'll read that out shortly. This is very, very problematical, because what Jesus and Paul were thinking of and referring to was a totally different model of church from what we know. And so what did they mean by church? They meant 20 to 70 people meeting in a house or a barn or a farm out building, and nobody was paid. There might be 4 or 5 or 6 elders, all know each other. They're all known, in the community. Nobody's income or pension or mortgage depends on being a leader of that church. They're all able to act honestly and honourably in what they do. So you go to that church and you go through the Matthew 18 procedure. Let me just tell you about Matthew 18. It says, if your brother sins, go and show him his fault in private. If he listens to you, you have won your brother. But if he does not listen, take 1 or 2 more with you, so that by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses every fact may be confirmed. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses even to listen to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. Now, so Paul's telling us not to sue each other, but to go to the church. Jesus is telling us to go to the church. Does that mean we should go to the church? Well, it does, but there's a problem. There aren't any churches to go to, because the churches that we could go to, if you go to St. Dudas or St. Thingamajig and go in, and there they are, there's perhaps 500 people who go to it, how can you get them to deal with your problem? Because the model they've got is totally different. You've got paid leaders who've got a career to worry about. They don't want fallouts and disputes. They don't want any dealings with this. Most of the people in the church don't know each other. Many of the people in the church aren't even believers, and if they are, they're not mature. And there's far too many of them. How could you have a dispute sorted out in that kind of setting? It's just completely impossible. I've tried it. I tried many years ago to deal with a leader I was the chairman of the trustees of a certain church, and the leader was behaving very badly, carnally, dishonestly, improperly.
How unusual.
Yeah. No, actually, yeah, that's right, quite common. But what was uncommon about it is I tried to do something about it. So I tried to carry out Matthew 18. So I wrote to him and went to see him one-to-one. That didn't get anywhere, so I wrote him a long letter explaining what my concerns were. So I was writing both as myself, an individual, and also chairman of the trustees of the church and responsible for all the staff. That got me nowhere, so he just became abusive and told lies about me and so on. So then I went back, I brought witnesses with me. I brought 2 witnesses who were fellow trustees on the board of the church. But they were both soppy and nice. They were nice Christians, but they were soppy. And all they wanted to do was smooth things over. And in any case, all he did was lie through his teeth to them. He lied about everything. And after that meeting was over, they'd left. And I said to him, why did you lie to them? Why did you lie about what we were doing? And he said, his words were, well, I've got to defend myself. He didn't even deny that he was lying. He just said, well, I've got to defend myself. And we didn't even get to stage 3. They wouldn't let it go to the wider church. And we got nowhere near stage 4, where the person is considered as a Gentile and a tax collector. We didn't get to that. In fact, in modern churches, you can't do that. You can't get to stage 4 because a church today, if it has charitable status, it must admit anyone admission to its public meetings. All its meetings are public and the public can come in. So you can't bar anybody from a church. Otherwise you'd have to give up charitable status. So Matthew 18, none of it except for stage 1 can be implemented really. Stage 3 and stage 4 can't be implemented. Stage 1 and stage 2 could be, but aren't in practice. So there, where do we stand? What do we do then? And the truth of it is that Paul's prohibition of suing one another is based on the assumption that we are real Christians dealing with a real Christian in a real church, in a biblical setup, where people take the Bible seriously. Well, it might be that none of those things are true. So if you're dealing with someone who's an apostate in an unbiblical church, with unbiblical leaders and apostate leaders, and none of them will take Paul or Jesus or the Bible seriously, I would put it to you that you're not under an obligation not to sue such a person. Now, this may never arise, but it has arisen for me, because I was a solicitor, and once someone came to me. He was a worship leader in a particular church, and he had lent money to a young couple getting married, and they didn't pay him the money back. He paid for them to get married to help them, and then they didn't pay him back. And they were quoting Paul to them. They were quoting 1 Corinthians to him and telling that he couldn't sue them. So anyway, they got a dose of me. So they got a solicitor who knew about Corinthians. So I wrote to them and said, well, I said, he might not sue you, but I will. And they paid up immediately. And they had the money. They weren't paying him. But they simply didn't want to pay because they didn't want to. And they were using 1 Corinthians to justify their non-payment of a debt. Wow. Now what will Jesus say about a person who misuses the Bible to justify their own wrongdoing, knowingly and consciously does that? Anyway, the point was, I judged in that situation that these people were not worthy of the protection that 1 Corinthian gives. And how could we go to the church about it? It was all a nonsense.
Also, in these situations, people are part of different churches anyway. So
well, as it happened, they were part of different churches, yeah.
If you've got people in different churches, then it makes it more difficult, even if they were biblical churches, because they wouldn't both be known. They
wouldn't both be in the same church. So how would you go down the road to St. Thingamajigs and ask the vicar to have a public meeting in the church to talk about the debt that your parishioner owes to me? And the whole thing just can't work. No one will let you do it. So anyway, this is perhaps a minority interest, so I'm going to skip these pages. There aren't many people that go around suing people like me.
Yeah, but that's interesting.
Okay, well there's more in the book about that. If you should you ever sue a fellow believer? Well, I think there are times when you could. What about going to the police or being a witness? I've had to be a witness in a criminal trial against a so-called Christian. Someone came to work for me, and then years later I got a letter asking me to give evidence of the fact that they'd worked for me, and I said, yeah, they worked for me. And this person was denying ever having worked for me, because while they were working for me, they were claiming benefits, and they'd said they'd never worked for me, never met me. So I had to do a witness statement saying they actually had worked for me, not for long. They worked for a month, and they didn't get through their probation, but I got rid of them because they were no good. But the point was, this was a person who purported to be a Christian, and I was asked to be a witness in a criminal trial. Now, was I entitled to? Would that breach 1 Corinthians? No. I don't think so, because first of all, it wasn't my claim. It wasn't a civil matter. It was a criminal matter. I was appearing as a witness.
And also you're submitting to the authorities.
Yes, I'm submitting to the legal authorities that Jesus Christ put in place. So he is the one that put the magistrates' courts in place. He's the one that implemented all that. And so I appeared as a witness, and I had to go all the way to trial, and then she turned up and admitted it. So she made me and several other bosses turn up. We all had to turn up and say that we knew her and she'd worked for us. And then she admitted it on the morning of. And so that's what she did. So we have to face the reality of what people are. But in any case, that was a criminal matter. And even the victim in a criminal matter, strictly speaking, in legal terms, is only a witness. Because when a person commits a crime, the person bringing the charge against them is not you. The person bringing the charge is the Queen. It's the Queen against Bloggs, the Queen against Smith. So the Queen is bringing the prosecution against them. In fact, God is, through the Queen, and you're just a witness, even if you're the victim. By the way, these pages are turning. Okay, well, we can list that. There's plenty more here that people can look at.
When you think in terms of what you've just been saying about the possibility of getting a decision in a church,
yes,
it makes you, it leads you to understand how difficult it is for a jury to get a unanimous decision.
Yeah.
Even with a number at like 12.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And quite often there are convictions on less than a full 12 being in favour, aren't they?
Only in rare circumstances they'll accept a majority verdict. Quite rarely. But yes, that's a good point. But you see, even after we've forgiven someone, we can continue to pray for them. There's an interesting little example here where Paul in 2 Timothy chapter 4 verse 16, he's writing to Timothy and he's talking about certain people who betrayed him or let him down. They didn't stand by him when he was on trial. So basically Paul used to find out who his real friends were when he was on trial and when he was in prison. Some people would come and visit him and others would sort of give him a wide berth. And he's writing to Timothy about this. But interestingly, in the middle of what he says, Paul suddenly breaks off and it gives a short prayer for those people. And this is something which goes a little bit beyond forgiveness. And he even asks that God will not hold those people responsible for what they did to him. Now I'm sure he's talking about the judgment seat. So here he says, at my first defence, no one took my part. All deserted me. May it not be charged against them. Now that is taking forgiveness to another stage, which is a good thing. Here's Paul doing it. Now, not only is Paul forgiving them in the narrow sense that we spoke of, he's going further. He's asking God not to judge them. He's asking Jesus to be merciful to them. He's saying, when the judgment seat comes, Jesus, please don't mention that event when they didn't turn up to help me. Just forget about it, will you? That's what he's saying. And that's a good thing. That's what Paul did. But that doesn't, as we've seen, you don't necessarily have to do that Paul did. It was right that Paul did that, but it's not necessarily right to do that all the time.
Is that like forgiveness going the extra mile?
It's going the extra mile, yeah. You're asking even Jesus to forgive them.
You did the same with Stephen.
Yes, that's right.
Moses did it and Abraham did it.
That's right. Now, Stephen, there's an interesting point that you raised there. You see, because this is we can never really know, but Paul was present witnessing the stoning of Stephen. That's right, he's holding the coats, and Stephen responds in an amazing way, and he prays for them. And Stephen says, Lord, do not hold this sin against them. Having said this, he fell asleep. But the interesting thing is, if you then track the progress of Paul from then on, Paul heard all that. Now you can only surmise, what did that do to Paul? First of all, how did Paul react to that? But secondly, and more importantly, how did God answer that prayer? Now, the thing is, Stephen gave up his life, and in departing this life, that's how he spoke. So he went more than the extra mile. These were men actually stoning him. It wasn't a past event, it was a present event. And then even in the midst of it, he's asking God to not hold it against them. Well, I think God literally answered Stephen's prayer.
Yeah.
And so the church lost Stephen but gained Paul as a consequence of what he did. But I think that brings you to this. There's great power in the prayer of a person who's forgiving. So if the victim is praying for the wrongdoer, I've written a page or two on this, but if you as the victim are praying for the wrongdoer, I think you constitute what the Bible calls a righteous man. And the prayer of a righteous man availeth much. And if you are in that position, praying from that vantage point, then basically, you know how we speak of how our prayers not even reaching heaven because our prayers are not getting through. Well, that's the kind of prayer that gets through. So that's the sort of prayer that comes to God as a telegram. He gets it, in comes an angel, there it is on a silver plate, it's opened in front of him and he takes note of a prayer like that. So that kind of prayer has power. I've put a page here on, does a person have the right to demand forgiveness of us? No, they don't. And I speak about that there. That church leader that I spoke of, two or three phrases that he said resonated with me. One of the things he said, after he'd admitted lying to the trustees, he said to me, "Can't you just let me off the hook?" That's what he said. Now, there was no repentance in him.
No.
And then this other phrase, which really rankled with me. He said, "Why don't we draw a line under all this?" Now, what he meant by drawing a line was, let me off, just forget about it. But there was no repentance, you see. So, but that, in a sense, that's another issue. But the point is, if you want to be technical about this, nobody has the right to be forgiven because we don't have the right to anything. And in Book 5, I speak quite a bit about the Human Rights Act and how misguided it is, because you don't have the right to anything. You don't even have the right to be alive. You don't have the right to anything. And you don't have the right to be forgiven. Forgiveness comes not from that person having a right to be forgiven. It comes from you having a duty to forgive. He doesn't have a right to be forgiven. You just have a duty to forgive.
Is it a duty or is it a voluntary thing?
Forgiveness is a duty because it's a command. See, we're commanded to forgive in the narrow sense. That's why I want to draw a distinction between the narrow definition of forgive and its wider, how how the ripples come out wider into things like mercy and grace and magnanimity and the continued lending of lawnmowers and things like that is a wider thing beyond forgiveness. So what if the wrongdoer is your parent? A brief point on this. You see, a lot of people I've got nothing to forgive my mum and dad for. Isn't that amazing? But there are people who do. So what if you're in a situation where you harbour bitterness towards a parent? Well, if you do, there are two issues at stake. Firstly, being unforgiving, and we've spoken of the ramifications of that. But let's imagine the person to whom you're unforgiving is a parent. If you do that, then not only are you being unforgiving, but you're failing to honour your father and mother. And there are serious implications to that. Whether they're alive or dead, it doesn't matter. So we're commanded to honour our father and mother. And if you are unforgiving and harbouring bitterness towards them, the point is that the blessings that come from honouring your father and mother won't come to you. And so there are further consequences. This is how tragic it is when parents mistreat or abuse kids. The ramifications go on into the next generation. So what we need to do, it's all the more important to forgive our parents. Thankfully, I've got nothing to forgive, but other people do, and it's quite a big problem. Yeah. And then forgiveness within marriage, another big one. Because there's a stupid line from a film called Love Story that says, "Love is never needing to say you're sorry." Well, whoever wrote that, I don't know what planet he lives on. He's certainly never been married. On the contrary, love means regularly having to say that you're sorry. The reverse side of the coin, however, The reverse side of the coin is regularly needing to accept such apologies and to grant forgiveness to one's spouse. Because if you don't do that, marriage becomes, you can't continue really. So as well as apologising, there also needs to be the acceptance, the giving of forgiveness. And a lot of marriages end, I think, because of a chronic, ongoing failure to forgive.
Yeah.
Hundreds and hundreds of things that build up into a reservoir.
Yeah.
And it would not happen if forgiveness was practiced within marriage.
Absolutely.
So, okay, well I'm going to skip more pages, and more pages, and even more. So let's finish at that. And I hope that's been helpful. But what I would be grateful for is if people can point out to me, are there any aspects, problems, difficulties of forgiveness that I've not dealt with? Things that, where the rubber has hit the road for you, and I might try and incorporate it in the, and I'll name you as well and say what would be.
But also this thing about taking back, you could forgive someone and then actually choose to
bring it back again.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. Because you see, this is the thing. Sometimes we forgive, but then we go and unforgive, don't we? Well, the answer to that is to forgive again. So if you recuse yourself, but then you nip back in and get one of the other clerks to put you back on the list so you can get your own back on your neighbour, then what do? He's back on your list again. What do? Go and see the first clerk, get him off the list again, forgive him again. That's true. Because
it's a bit like what you said earlier, isn't it? The devils are out to sort of rob you.
Yes.
And they'll bring to your remembrance the terrible thing that happened and bring it all.
Yes. Exactly.
And they make you sort of feel,
That's right.
Well,
they'll play on your feelings to get you to withdraw your forgiveness and to revoke your forgiveness. But if you can realise that your feelings have got nothing to do with it, then it makes it a good deal harder for the demon to play that trick on you. Because all you'll say is, look, demon, cut it out. I know that my feelings have got nothing to do with it. Yes, I do feel pretty wretched, but that's nothing to do with it. So I'm not going to revoke my forgiveness. Moreover, thank you for reminding me. I reaffirm my forgiveness. And if you do that, they'll probably leave you alone. Yeah. So, here endeth the lesson.
Thank you.
Okay.